Well, good morning from Smoky, California. Welcome everyone today. It's a capacity filled webinar today, lots of registration. We are so excited to have David Bonbright, a champion of stakeholders' voice here today with us. So I'm very excited to having his presence and learning from him. So the current pandemic has turned all the norms upside down. While everybody's awakening, with from the shareholder economy to the stakeholders, David has been preaching that concept for years. And so I'm so excited that this topic is so timely and about the right time to understand and right way of doing the stakeholder voice-based approach altogether. I welcome David to this, our popular All About Outcome series. As many of you know, it's gaining tremendous popularity, and I thank you all for participating regularly on our webinars. Next, we are participating. We have a very exciting lineup. A founder of New Sunrise, who's going to be talking about 9 different collective impact initiatives in Philadelphia region. Followed by, I'm so excited to announce Jane Reisman. Many of you may know from ORS Impact, and somebody who's very famous in IMM space, impact measurement and management space, and Veronica Olasbao, who is being from Rockefeller Foundation, who will be coming soon. So very excited to see the lineup, and we hope to drive the topic of impact management forward and doing the right way, essentially. So for those who are not familiar with the SoPact is a driving force for stakeholder voice that focuses on the impact measurement and management doing the right way. So you are welcome to tune into our popular YouTube series as well as the All About Outcome series altogether. And thank you again for all the support and for you to make it a popular webinar series. David Bonbright is a co-founder and chief executive of Keystone Accountability. Many of you may have heard of him. He's author of many books and he's a regular contributor to the professional journals. Keystone seeks to maximize social impact of organizations through constitutional voice. I'm sure I cannot just do the justice if I have to introduce David in a few minutes. I will start by agreeing with David, as he says, by listening and responding to the beneficiaries, the impact will be enhanced. It turned out that we are not only connected by our passion for bringing stakeholders' voice to the top of the impact ecosystem, but we also have a spiritual alignment with a common thread, service space. Nipun Mehta, with whom I have a lot of privilege here in the Bay Area, and David has been very closely connected with the service space as well. Service space is an experiment of creating external change while keeping the focus on internal transformation. David has also a rich history of working in international development sector for the last 3 decades. He has worked as a grant maker, manager of Aga Khan Foundation, Ford Foundation, Oak Foundation, and Ashoka. In early 1990, he founded and led 2 African citizen sector resource centers, one relating to the organizational development and one relating to the information and technology. He also played an instrumental role in the processes that gave birth to the South African Grantmaker Association and South African NGO Coalition. He led the first Africa program of Ashoka, Innovators for the Public. On the top of this, David sits on the number of boards, advisory councils, and the knowledge networks. I'm so grateful to have him here today and looking forward to learning more about his work and why he thinks that measuring the social impact is a context goal. So David, welcome, and thank you for your time today, and I look forward to listen, and I'm sure many other listeners are ready to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Unmesh. That's a very generous introduction, and I'm delighted to be with a group of people here today who share my passion for measurement, in particular an approach to measurement that really privileges the points of view, the voices, and the agency of the people that are meant to benefit from our work. I'm gonna try to give a quick overview of the methodology that we've developed, but before I do, I want to go into a little bit of background and acknowledge the present moment that we're in. These are not normal times, as Unmesh noted, and I don't think that what was normal is something we'll ever have again. I think that we are in a serious disruptive moment globally as a species, and if you follow things like systems thinking and complexity theory, which intrigue me, the argument there is that if you look at the cycles that typically happen in an ecosystem, they reach a point of degrees of interdependence and complexity where the systems start to release and break and come apart. And in that time when things are actually starting to come apart because the systems have been pushed to their limits, there's this incredible opportunity to shape the way in which we come back together. I think they talk, if you go with the Hollings adaptive cycle, this is called the omega phase, and arguably that's where we are today. We're in this unique and I think very exciting opportunity to actually put the world back together in a better way, and measurement and the way we measure is a really powerful tool to do that. So that's the spirit, and that's the place that I'm really coming from as I talk about our work today. But really, it's as part of a different, fundamentally different approach to measurement that is really designed to help us all move together as we kind of put the world back together. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now because I have some slides I want to share with you. Let's see. I guess it's this one. Oh, this one. Try that. Okay. Does everyone see the first screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. So, sorry, didn't mean to do that. So I titled this social impact measurement as a contact sport, and I hope that becomes clear why I'm using that as the title by the end, but feel free to ask if it's not clear. And I'm going to try to approach this very simply, a classic three-part structure, a little bit on the problem, a little more time on reframing the problem, and then most of the time on our proposed solution. I say my part in the problem because for the first 25 years that I spent working in development and social change, I think I was a bit more like those two fellows on the cartoon there than I was the mice in the terrarium. And the point here is that measurement ultimately, and the way we do our work, is a reflection of a mindset. And if your mindset is one of an external observer trying to manipulate the system, and maybe coming in from time to time and doing impact studies in experimental ways, you're really locked into a model of working that is where decision-making is centralized, it's top-down, it's professional, it's technically biased. And all kinds of problems come from that. The second cartoon captures a second dimension to the nature of the measurement problem, and that is that we live in a complex world where people come at these things and stand in different places, and so in a sense, impact itself is subjective. And so kind of where you sit is where you stand. How you experience it determines your sense of what the impact is. And so when you're measuring, if you measure from one perspective, you're not capturing another person's perspective or another community's perspective. And so there's this challenge of how do we get to an approach to measurement that addresses this subjective character. So those are kind of two big framing problems in measuring social impact. Now for the reframe, the big reframe, and it's happened, it's been going on for 20, 30 years. It's initially in small corners, but now increasingly becoming part of the mainstream conversation. And really it's a reframe from trying to, when we come to measure, trying to prove things, to actually using measurements and focusing on trying to improve things. And the essential frame becomes one of learning. Learning at the individual level, at the organization level, at the community level, and at the societal level. And over the last, I don't know, 20 years, there's been a real explosion, I think, of creative, interesting, alternative approaches to measuring in social change that reflect these values of trying to promote improving rather than proving, and learning and improvement. And we've thrown up a bunch of different examples of this here, and if you look at these images from covers of reports or people's websites, one of the themes that comes through here that's really important, and it's a key part of our work, is this notion of moving from accountability as a unidirectional process from the less powerful to the more powerful, say from the person receiving the funding being accountable to the person providing the funding in a development aid context, to one of mutual accountability, where the flow of accountability goes both ways, and the whole process of dialogue and reflection is central to understanding what measurement means and what we're trying to do by way of development. And so, this idea of top-down versus bottom-up has really given way to an idea of top-down and bottom-up. And then at its most sophisticated level, it becomes a conversation about, okay, top-down and bottom-up is great, but how do they fit together? How do they meet? And the key word there is mutuality. And I think increasingly, many of us are arguing that the way to think about effectiveness in social change is to think of it as mutual accountability. Now, when you peel that away, you come to relationships. And so the kind of hypothesis that's at the core of our approach to measurement is very simple. It's that relationships matter, that in the real world, relationships drive outcomes. The better the relationship, the better the outcome. Now, if that's true, and I think it's kind of commonsensically true, and you see it, I think, everywhere you look, it becomes obvious that you should measure and manage to relationship quality, which is not typically something we do. We value relationships, but we don't take the time to measure and manage to them. And this kind of insight hit us when we were in the early years of Keystone in the early 2000s, and we were scrapping around to try to innovate in the measurement space, and decided that relationships was a key thing. And we looked around and said, well, who's doing the measuring? Who's measuring relationships? And came up with an interesting and surprising answer for us, because we were a bunch of development and human rights people. And the answer was consumer-facing businesses and the customer satisfaction industry. And we took a deep look at what was happening in the customer satisfaction industry in the early 2000s, and discovered this extraordinary tool that was expanding very quickly called Net Promoter Score. And I'm sure most of you have heard of it. And it's a fascinating example of a fairly mature industry. Customer satisfaction was an industry that emerged from market research in the 1960s. And by the time we came along and started looking at it, it had been developing for 40 years, multi-billion-dollar industry worldwide, literally hundreds of thousands of companies surveying their customers every day and really trying to manage their work according to what they heard back from their customers. And Net Promoter came along and simplified that by saying, what if you just asked one question on a regular basis and then managed to what you learned from that question? And they came up with the question, after having done a lot of research, how likely would it be that you recommend, my company or product to a friend or colleague on a scale of 0 to 10? And so we looked at that and studied it and married it to the participatory methodologies that we had grown up with and used in development, and came up with something new, which we call Constituent Voice, which kind of blends participatory methodologies with Net Promoter Score kind of insights. And at the essence of it, it's a process of asking a very small number of questions, maybe over a course of a year, no more than 10 or 12, in micro surveys, meaning that no single survey is asking more than a couple of questions, but on a frequent basis, so that you're getting a pulse from society, and that you quickly analyze that in clear and simple ways, and then put the findings and the questions back to the people that you're working with, and together explore ways to improve on those scores. And then you make changes on the basis of those learning exploratory kind of sense-making dialogues. And then you start the cycle over again with more questions and asking again, and including asking a new question, which is that specific improvement that we have come up with together, is that making things better or not? And so we once you have this process going, we call it a learning loop, whose purpose is to allow for continual improvement together. And all three words there are critically important. Continual is an ongoing process. Improvement, that's what it's about. And together, which is, I think, the unique word that we added, which is that you can't have one part of the ecosystem moving forward without another part, where you end up with shadows building in the system, which ultimately come back and bite you. And I think we've all been seeing a lot of how that happens in the world over the last few years. I mean, one example that I like to point to is something as simple and obvious and powerful as public vaccinations reached a point where people were so distrustful of it that an anti-vaccination movement grew up in a number of countries where these public health issues had been totally settled. And that then started to breed deeper distrust. And you could argue there's a direct line from the anti-vaccination movement in the US through to the current incumbency in the presidency. So that's the kind of thing that ends up happening if you don't move forward together around the signals that you're agreeing are describing what's happening in your world, what impact looks like. It's an extreme example, but I think it's all too familiar. So that's Constituent Voice in a nutshell. Just a couple more things about it. Once you have a learning loop that's based on this micro survey ask and answer process, where you're inviting people to tell you how they're experiencing you and what they want and how your performance is, once you have that, you can put into it other kinds of evidence that you're collecting. So it's very important, especially for this audience, because I know a lot of you are serious measurers and evaluators. What we're saying is, alongside your learning loop that's based on these micro surveys and the Constituent Voice cycle, once you can bring other evidence that you're collecting, including evidence through impact studies, your regular monitoring, output data, activity data, input data, whatever relevant evidence you have, evidence from what's happening in similar places elsewhere, you can take that evidence and you can bring it into your learning loop and share it and discuss it, whether it's an internal learning loop with staff or an external learning loop with your funders or with the people that you mean to help. But so it's a way, it creates this, if you will, this venue or this channel by which all the relevant evidence can be discussed. So it's not just about perceptual feedback data that's coming from surveys. It's about a system of learning together using all the best evidence that you can bring. Okay, so that's the essence of the tool. Let me then, what I want to do now is turn and talk about the 4 design principles which we have learned are critical for the successful use of this tool. And we didn't actually, I call them design principles, but actually we kind of saw them emerge as core design principles in the experience of doing this. We kind of, over the last 10 years of working with about 250 organizations and helping them build constituent voice systems, that's what we do at Keystone. We help people build and run their constituent voice systems. We've learned that these are the 4 key principles that define success for doing this. So they're complexity, simple, ecosystem, complexity, simple, inclusive, and momentum. And I'll just quickly run through what each of them means, and then we'll move into our conversation. So ecosystem, I actually alluded to in my introduction, that we're living in a time where that we're reaching kind of system omega phase, where systems are starting to release, and there's an opportunity to reconfigure. But the point about this with respect to measurement is that in a complex system where everything affects everything else, you can't just measure in one point and leave it there. You actually have to share the measures across the whole ecosystem. In other words, the tools that we want are not organization level measurement tools, they're system level measurement tools. And we need to capture the interconnectedness and interdependence. And by doing that, we can break out of the silos, both inside our organizations and the silos of our organizations, and create a learning loops across different stakeholders or constituents in the ecosystem, which is really first prize. That's what you need to be doing. So what we see with some of our clients and partners is that when they begin to have use the CV cycle, they generate a very different conversation in their ecosystem, whether it's with their funders or their partners or the people they're trying to serve. And that becomes a much more creative, generative process, because it's not an internal conversation. It's starting to see the whole of the system that they're in. Okay, so the way I just want to illustrate this with using Big Aid. So this is a very simple schematic of what Big Aid might look like in the world today. And it's crude and simplified, but more or less, this is how Big Aid works. On the far left, you have the executive branch and the parliament, which are providing money to the National Aid Agency, and the National Aid Agency then makes contracts and grants with direct partners, who then make contracts and grants to indirect partners, who ultimately work with communities and people and projects. And the process of information and measurement is going back the other way, and that is one of information extraction for the most part, and accountability upwards for the money. And that's pretty much how the system works. And if we were going to then visualize that system as transformed by constituent voice or reliable feedback data or a more dialogic improvement process, it would add in these red elements, and it would look like this. And okay, this is an idealized version of what it would look like, but it's just to create, just the point of this is really to share that it's not about just listening to beneficiaries. It's about creating a dialogic approach through the entire system based on the best evidence that you can get in these recurrent learning loops that are aiming to improve in small steps. Okay, the second principle we came to is simplicity, and I really have to credit Net Promoter Score for teaching me this. The customer satisfaction industry by the late 90s, early 2000s was really it was asking lots of questions of customers, and people were complaining about these long surveys, and companies couldn't cope with all the data that the clever consultants were giving them on the basis of the surveys. And you know, you can always learn things by studying the problem and asking people lots of questions, and consultants making money out of that developed a lot of questions. But it wasn't, it was slowing things down. It wasn't speeding things up. And this cartoon, I think, captures the reality of how most measurement is done in the social space, is the third one there. With a complicated cause and effect model with indices of multivariable components weighted by quality, retention, satisfaction, value, price tolerance, and on and on and on. What we need, if you really want people to actually manage and improve with a metric, you've got to keep it simple. And you have to trust that if the metric is just pushing you in the right direction, people will figure out ways to get to the outcomes that you want. So if it's a true question, like the Net Promoter question, which you see on the cartoons here, it will guide you in the right way. And then the process of figuring it out and improving becomes the job of everyone in the system, because now they have a North Star to follow based on the question. So simplicity. Third principle is inclusive. It's a basic, I think everyone who's ever worked in any kind of development program or achieved any kind of social impact is very aware that whatever the project or the intervention is, it doesn't hit everyone the same way. That you may try to deliver an equal service and a fair service across the community, but it never works out that way for myriad reasons. And so it's very important in your constituent voice microsurvey system that in addition to asking the question, you are able to discover within the population that's responding to you who's experiencing you in a different way. And so with all of our systems, we work with our partners to find out what are the key characteristics in the communities of the people that you're serving: gender, age, ethnicity, race, language, education level, whatever happens to be. We make sure that the survey system allows you to disaggregate the data so that you can see these differences. And then when you go back in and have conversations with respondents, with the community about the data, everyone together is able to own the challenge of making sure those who are not benefiting do benefit. And it's a way to kind of crowdsource that as well, so that it becomes not the organization's problem, but all of our opportunity to make that everyone feels that that is in fact receiving the benefit. So principle 3 is inclusive. And then the last principle is to build momentum through repetition and get what Jim Collins, the business guru who wrote this wonderful book, Good to Great, including Good to Great in the nonprofit sector, excellent book, calls the flywheel effect. And you have to get this process moving and turning, the cycle turning. So it's one thing to have your constituent voice cycle where you're asking questions, analyzing, reflecting, and making changes, and that's part of this larger flywheel. But once you have that, you then have to do the next thing, which is micro monitoring, which is actually asking people whether the corrective actions that you're taking are making things better or not. And once people are starting to respond to you about whether you're making improvements or not, now you're on a winning path. And then the next thing is you manage your entire program to make sure that the work that you're doing, that you're driving up that rate of improvement. And then lastly, this comes back to the point about relationships. You lean in on relationships, and as your relationships deepen, you come back around the cycle and start again. So, so that's principle 4, which is go for the flywheel effect and create momentum. My last slide is just to say, once we'd figured this out, we looked around for a tool that that had these principles embedded in it, that would allow people to undertake surveys and drive it through to a kind of feedback or constituent voice system. And there wasn't one. There's millions of tools out there that allow you to run surveys and things like that, but there was nothing that did this this kind of system. And so we built it ourselves. And I invite you all to come have a look at it. It's called the Feedback Commons, so it's feedbackcommons.org, and see what you think, and let me know what you think about it. And that's pretty much it. And maybe just to conclude by throwing a question back to Unmesh to say, you know, how is it that you all are tackling stakeholder engagement and voice there with SoPact, and maybe a conversation for us to have after this, how do we do it together?
Thank you, David. It's, you know, when I saw presentation this morning, I said, oh, this is something very different and when I went to this your presentation, this cannot be more clearer. This is very easy and very lucid, and I'm really appreciate the way, and I'm sure the very giant present we have today, they all enjoyed what you just really talked about. And it's essentially to all of you in this this large webinar we have, which is really, we are all in together. We are all trying to do different things, but towards this common goal altogether. And so really, I think fundamentally, it really, we also want to participate in, as David, you said, and how SoPact is want to do it is really, as you know, in some way, if you look at the current state of impact measurement and management, in many ways, it is advanced and it is still a long way to go. There are so many standards have been emerged, frameworks like impact management project to theory change has been around for a long time. Impact management project is relatively new, but gaining tremendous traction, which is really aligning around stakeholder voice as well. And fundamentally also providing the whole process and in the COVID time, essentially, where things have even changed and how you collect the data. So SoPact has been really working relentlessly, and many of you, if you don't know us, essentially we've been around for 5 years, and we're relentlessly focusing on this also stakeholder voice. And obviously our approach is to be taking all the different standards and frameworks and tools out there and simplify that for the entire impact ecosystems, from asset owners to asset managers to asset, so that ultimately it can drive the collaborative approach between the different players to understand the stakeholder voice in a very rapid fashion. When we started out, and maybe I can share my slide to make some 3 points, and I'm going to keep my things to very limited, but I want to make a point which is really where we can add the value essentially. And let's see, I can share my screen. Oops. Does everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, great. So the 3 points I want to drive. One is that as we were working with a large number of clients, essentially, one area that we saw many people gotten stuck is that they were all still trying to build the strategies. And in fact, a lot of the times, people were trying to build the surveys and data collection without having strategy altogether. And we thought this could be a big barrier for us to drive the process of standardization process of managing impact. One thing that we've been relentlessly working is that we consider that there's tremendous amount of knowledge out there. If you see here, we have a very gigantic catalog of metrics catalog. Each of the metrics, more than 50 metrics catalog from different standards. Many of them aligned to a sustainable development goal. And there's also ways you can build a complete impact strategy based on theory of change and impact management project. And as many of you may know, there are so many standard profiles being contributed by many impact practitioners like you, and IDS Plus is a very good example of that. And you can start by theory of change or IMP-based approach, but there's no need to start from scratch at all. And so there's so many knowledge out there. Why not we just start this thing and give it to everybody? And by the way, people have been doing this thing for ages on Excel. Why not we give out this platform for free so that there's no barrier or there's no friction to get started? So we invite any social enterprises or any practitioners to start their journey more rapidly so that they can start from this hundreds of template and essentially from thousands of metrics so that they can build the strategy in a more rapid manner and ultimately align their goals with the SDG and impact management goals. So this is a one barrier that we hope to reduce it altogether. Second barrier that I see very much is essentially how we as a users are really struggling to collect the data from various different sources. Whether data could be coming from the Salesforce, or it maybe come from offline data collection tool, or essentially it can come from online surveys. Fundamentally, we believe that the process of collecting data should not be difficult at all. And in fact, regardless of where the data come in, there should be one place you really understand it, just like a data warehouse where you can understand the impact over the period of time. Now, one place where most people are really struggling is to understand what that impact is essentially. And so what we are trying to do in that space is to really try to design the system in such a way that you can understand the impact through the longitudinal approach, where you can see the difference between the countries, different chapters, different locations, or even demographics in a much more shorter fashion. So David, our goal is to really provide this kind of tool to the frontline manager to simply run the question, design the survey question, align with the impact management project automatically, and have that information available to the frontline manager. So rather than having this long cycle that you talked about, just give that information to the frontline workers and make them data scientists, because all the intelligence is already there when you ask this question. So why not give them those kind of information so that they can storytell around who is the beneficiary, what are the outcomes they are creating, what is the contribution, impact, risk, and what is the depth, scale, and impact altogether. And that the technology has immense power to solve this kind of problems altogether. And that's where we are after, and we really hope to be one of the contributors out of hundreds of you that you are here today. But that's our solution, obviously, to how this impact management can accelerate. And as you rightly pointed out, I mean, the time is now, and we need to start changing stakeholder-based approach. And if you don't use this opportunity, obviously, we'll be missing it big time altogether. So that's a SoPact's approach. I'm going to invite Lorena and Madhu, who's from our team, to. There are lots of questions, and I hope that all the questions are for David. If there are any questions for us, actually we can take it offline, and we can set up a call time with us as well. But fundamentally, this is a time for David. So please, Lorena and Madhu, please go through the questions for David, and I would be happy to listen in background.
Yeah. So there are many questions for David, definitely. We'll go in the order as the questions were coming in. So the first one is, David, you were talking about how accountability now has to be mutual, and from the person who has the most power to the person who has less power. But we have a question here about what about peer-to-peer or horizontal rather than vertical, top-down, or bottom-up accountability?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great point. And there was a very good article recently in the Stanford Social Innovation Review about peer-driven change, about the work of the Family Independence Initiative and its founder, Mauricio Lim Miller. And I'm a huge fan of that work. I think in some ways the peer self-organizing, if you will, in the old days we used to call this community self-help approach, in a sense is already beyond the paradigm that I'm talking about. The paradigm I'm talking about is one where there's outsiders coming to intervene and support inside a system, and how to do that in a way of mutual accountability and effectiveness. And the peer-led change model is one where people self-organize and really therefore own their own developments, and then others can come in around that because they've found their power and they're representing it. I think that's the ideal way to go, really, and the right way. And I think we are super supportive of peer models. And again, we can listen to what people are saying about their experience by asking them about it and then sharing that to outsiders who want to help. There's always a role for outside help, but even in a peer-led model. But the key, I think, the same point that I'm making, my main point around CV and the way it works and peer-driven change, is that the leadership, the ownership, the initiative needs to sit with those who are living the problems. And therefore, they're going to be the ones that are really going to solve them.
Thank you for that. So you were also talking about having one or two questions, maybe like a short survey, something that you can just use as a feedback system. We have a question here. How useful are real-life stories in measuring impact in terms of accountability, voice, and responsiveness?
Well, there's a lot in that question. I'm not sure I'll get it right. The first thing I'll say is that, you know, there's a Yiddish saying that God invented people because he likes to hear stories. Stories is this essence of how we learn. It's the way our brains work. It's how we establish our relationships. It's core to everything, stories. So I feel like at some level, real life stories are critical. And I feel now that this conversation has been a little conceptual and I haven't told enough stories, for which I apologize. But you might be asking something else in that question. I think it's about whether the whole survey model is too directive and that it's not open enough. And again, I just want to say I completely agree with that. And that's why we only use it to get a pulse, to get a signal, to get a direction. So it doesn't really tell you very much. If you think about the Net Promoter question, how likely would you be to recommend, you know, David and Keystone's Constituent Voice to another organization on a scale of 0 to 10? It really doesn't tell you anything at all about much about it, except how likely they would be to recommend it. So the task of figuring things out happens after you've got that score. So it's really it's a goad to learning more than anything else. And that's why in our methodology, the key point, the key step in the process is when you go back and say, hey, this is what the micro survey says. What does it really mean? How should we improve? God, scores. What's going on here? How do we fix that? So I think that you have to. So yes, surveys are limited, but we try to use them in a very specific way, which is to create a shared investigation and solve problem solving.
If I may add, David, to this, agree with this. The real work starts after the information has been collected. I also feel that the social sector data sciences lag significantly behind the traditional commercial data science. And there are so many different interesting things that in social sector, which even the corporate sector doesn't know. I mean, for example, how you collect the data and represent that in the form of 5 dimensions of impact. If you do it in the right way and analyze and give that kind of a real-time dashboard to the frontline workers so that they can compare the results in instant fashion between multiple locations, between the multiple the demographics or the information, I think you can make it very, very useful and make impact sexy, very, very, and like one of our customers says that I like to come every day and see in my dashboard and see what has changed, what do things say, and that's the
and said it. But when you sit down and talk to people, they have a logic about what they're trying to do and how the things they're doing are going to lead to it for the most part. So I think we certainly operate from a theory of change approach. You have to have the logic and the thinking behind your work to be able to then assess it and improve. The dialogue piece, I think the key thing about this dialogue approach that we advocate is this word together. It's, in other words, who measures, who decides, how do we improve? And what we're saying is, the more you can do that together, the more you can, one of these buzzwords that use, crowdsource that, the more that it can become owned together across, then the more likely you're going to get sustainable outcomes. And by the way, you'll generate a lot of energy and a lot of innovation, a lot of new ideas. And that's what we need.
And we have a question about how the concept of the learning loop can be effectively used in the context of a large scale or complex development interventions.
Sure. Well, actually, this alludes to some of the things that Unmesh has been emphasizing. Because if you run a learning loop in a particular setting within a much larger program, so in a small part of a program, one village, one clinic, one school, even though you're working across 50 clinics or 1,000 clinics or a countrywide program doing antiretrovirals, for example, you don't have to run learning loops everywhere. You can run enough of them to be able to really generate powerful learning findings, insights, and then you can share those across the entire program. So, so the answer is that you can do a representative sample of your large program and then invest the rest of your time in making sure those who you're working with, frontline staff and the communities, are able to really interrogate, engage with those insights.
Okay. We have a question in the constituent, I guess they try to type, voice system. For example, an inclusive and continuous loop. Who will make a final decision to take momentum? How do you train, suggest your clients to master such a decision for actions?
Right, that's a great, so there's a lot of, I mean, I think the last 30 years, there's just been a tremendous amount of really excellent training and support for good facilitation, good participatory practice at the community level. So I think that's relatively available, and that's the kind of process that we would like to see in these dialogue sessions, so that you can really come to a decision. And here's the one thing I would say. I like the question a lot, because it's often hard to get people to agree to change something, to do something different, to try something. And I think the key to this process is to emphasize that these don't have to be carved in stone changes, that it's not a big deal that when you try an improvement action, just try a small thing. look, we've got this problem. Young people are really not responding to this program. Why don't we just try one thing that the young people want to do and see if that takes us somewhere interesting? And in 3 months, we'll come back together and we'll look at how that's doing. So I think take the weight, the heaviness off of this, and actually give people permission to try stuff and then assess it and then improve from there. So convey that idea that there's not so much at stake when you do that. The key is to develop a new mindset, this mindset of trying things, a growth mindset, if you will, of not being a perfectionist, that it has to be the ultimate before I do it, but actually take small steps and reflect together and then move forward. So kind of you de-escalate that decision and make it easier to get agreement.
It's like in my technology world, I used to say that system thinker or system architect job is to make complex problems look simpler and also make it more iterative altogether and inclusive for the team altogether. So agree.
Yeah, so next question is, in how much are our methods understood and owned by the constituencies we are trying to serve? Could it be possible to have constituencies generate their own research methods, asking their own questions in their own ways?
I mean, that's the goal. That's the goal. And I love that question. And that's the challenge to us, I think, at Keystone. And we always try to bring that spirit into our work with clients, that ultimately, you know, even the introduction of a process like this, which is meant to foster and facilitate people's own learning and their own ownership of their own learning, has a risk of displacing their own creativity and that. And so I think I take that question as a warning that I carry with me, and that's a beautiful statement of where we want to get to. Oh, except the one thing I would say is that ultimately, we are in relationships, all of us. We're all connected. And if you're coming in from outside to help, and if communities need external resources, how we manage that connection and fit into their process is really important. I'm noticing on the Q&As that there's a lot of concrete, practical questions people are asking that we probably won't get to. And I just want to make a little statement that we have a lot of how-to material on our website. There's a technical note there of about 30 pages, and it really lays out how you do constituent voice. And we have a lot of kind of guides and things. So they're all free to download. So please feel free to look at that. I noticed this one leaped out at me as, how long would a typical cycle take, a CV cycle? And I just to answer that, it typically however long it takes at the beginning, and sometimes it'll take people 9 months to a year to do their first cycle. It drives me mad, but it's just organizations can be slow. But by the time they've been doing it for a while, it gets shorter and shorter and shorter, so that we have lots of clients that are closing cycles within 30 days now. But you have to build the muscle.
We have a very interesting question here. What do you do about the embedded bias that comes from the fact that people who answer surveys belong to a particular type of personality, and therefore you may still be missing out on all the people who aren't responding? Yeah.
So that's true. And it's the same answer to the question earlier about the limitations of surveys because they point in a certain direction, they're not open. And the answer is that we actually, when we encourage clients when they're going back and sharing the findings to say, look, these are not perfect, they're full of biases, to help in fact educate the community about the nature of bias in the survey process. But then say, okay, but it's still some data. What do we think about it? Does it relate to our reality? And so the real place where the work happens is in that shared sense-making dialogue moment. So we're using the survey finding, the data, to trigger what really matters, which is the exploration. And when people from a community look at the data, they'll tell you whether they think it's representative or accurate or reflects their experience or not, very clearly.
Mm-hmm. We only have a couple of minutes left, but we still have many questions. David, are you able to go over for a couple of minutes or?
Sure, I'm okay.
Yeah, okay. So if people want to hang out with us for a few minutes more, we can continue answering 2 or 3 more questions. So we have one question here. How well does the feedback model work when dealing with survival needs, such as food aid? Is the power imbalance so extreme that it distorts any useful feedback?
Actually, this is where there's a kind of craft that can come in here to deal with that. But we have a sister organization called Ground Truth Solutions, which you can check out, and they work exclusively in humanitarian crisis settings doing feedback loops and constituent voice work. And they've had tremendous success in improving humanitarian interventions by creating a deeper responsiveness to people. And so it is a challenging setting. It does highlight the power dynamics and often survival is at stake. I mean, it really raises the stakes. But 80% or something like that of all humanitarian settings are chronic. They're ongoing, and so there's opportunities there to really work on the power dynamics and empower the recipients.
Mm.
I'm sorry, I gather you can hear me, but I apologize and I'll say goodbye. I've somehow lost the audio.
Yeah.
Weird.
So I'll wrap it up.
I didn't do anything, I promise. Thank you, everyone.
Just fine. Thank you so much.
Happy to take emails. I gave you my email there if anyone wants to follow up with me. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.